Hello, and welcome to another edition of Ask the Professor, where we respond to your questions on history, economics, current events, pretty much anything that touches on our life together in the community.
And here's one from Bill, who saw something you wrote recently, some anti-French thing, in which you wrote something very bad about the metric system. So Bill says, after reading this, I have got to ask, what is wrong with the metric system?
Okay. No, I'm not anti-French. I hasten to add, I had a delightful
You married
time.
one.
I was in France in 1914 for the World War I documentary, and I was just
In 1914,
overwhelmed.
you were in France.
In 2014,
Right.
100th anniversary, I should say.
You're not that old either.
Well, I got very absorbed in my subject. And I was overwhelmed by the generosity of people, how welcome they made us feel. I feel that the French deserve a better government than they've got, and I'm astounded that they can make the government they have work as well as they do. I don't think anybody else could do it. That's a tribute to the French. But the metric system. I hate the metric system. The metric system is an attempt to impose abstract reason instead of relying upon human experience. It must be better because, even though no one's ever done it this way, a bunch of intellectuals think it up and they force it upon us. And that is almost always a recipe for disaster. But I never understood quite what it was that was wrong with the metric system until my colleague at the time at the Ottawa Citizen, David Warren, took it on. And he said, in the imperial system, the measures were related to things that we actually experience in our lives. And one of the examples he gave, a pound. A pound is a rock that is light enough to throw, but heavy enough to do damage. And that, okay, maybe we don't want to go throwing rocks at each other, but that's a pound is kind of a intuitive measure. What's a kilogram? What in your life weighs a kilogram?
2.2 pounds.
Yeah, exactly. And who wants 2.2 pounds of butter? Who wants a kilogram of anything? Or a mile. You know what a mile is? A mile is a distance you can comfortably stroll. If it's a mile or less, sure, fine, we'll walk there. If it's more than a mile, you got to think about going. What's a kilometer? It isn't anything. I mean, it's 1,000 meters. Now, a meter is something. You know what a meter is?
It's a yard.
It's a yard, exactly. The meter got lucky. It just happened to come out the same length as something that you'd actually want. But the entire metric system would say, it's easier to do, right, so that we don't get to practice our math skills and then they atrophy. It's not even an advantage. And, one of the things about base 10, which I think came out because we happen to have, 10. But if you're working in base 12, including in the Old English money, you can divide it in half, you can divide it in a quarter, you can divide it in a third. 10 is actually not a very well-behaved number from that point of view.
Mm-hmm. But, and you know what? I'm actually reading a book that another one of our sponsors sent me. It's called Here's Looking at Euclid. I'll put a picture on the screen right now so you see it if you're interested in this. But he talks about this and why base 10 is actually not very good. Now, I got lost a bit through that argument, but it's still interesting. But I will get back and defend the metric system, okay? Because I was born at a time where I'm bilingual. I speak both languages and measurements. I can do miles, I can do pounds. I'm actually better at pounds than kilo, but I'm much better at kilometers than miles. And so, what I do like about the metric system is that it's easy to teach. A centimeter, 10, it's plus multiplied by 10, multiplied by 100, multiplied by 1,000. It's a lot easier to understand when you don't know anything about a system of measurements.
Yeah, and Esperanto is easier to teach than any actual language.
That's why nobody speaks it.
Orderly, logical, sterile, and has not evolved from the folk wisdom of the human race.
But you're just old-fashioned.
I was in England when they got rid of the old money, and I knew at the time that I was in the presence of a tragedy. I mean, sure, 12 pence to the shilling, 20 shillings to the pound, 21 shillings to the guinea.
Who misses
two
that?
2.5 shillings.
Other than you.
I missed that.
No, other than
it was wonderful.
Find me 10 people who care.
And they got rid of their money. They got rid of their old system of counties. Everything that had been worked out over centuries by the wisdom of people in trial and error was chucked out the window in favor of a series of arid abstractions, and we are not better off for it. And I mean, now we're used to the metric system. You probably couldn't get rid of it again. But you know what is it? Oh, it's miles and miles away. Yeah, it's miles and miles away. You know what it is? It is miles and miles away. And I mean, I like the British system too. They had 14 pounds was a stone, right? And they give people's weight in stone, and you got to practice your math. But it had history to it. It had character to it. It had depth. It had dimensions. This is the metric system is perfectly suited to Brave New World, and I don't want to go there.
I know secretly why you don't like this, because the imperial system reminds you of common law and the fact that the laws and the rules came from the people and from everyday experience, whereas the metric system reminds you of the Napoleonic type French civil law codes of law, where they just decide what the laws are going to be and tell people how to behave.
Yeah, exactly. Things imposed from above because intellectuals thought they were a good idea. It's like the family. Oh, well, we've had the family for thousands of years. That thing was evolved by grubby know-nothing peasants in the dirt. We need to know what sociologists think would be the ideal management of the human units. Or you look at cities. Look at the difference between, if you're going to go on a cruise or something and you go and see cities, I want to see Vienna, or I want to see St. Petersburg, or I want to see Paris. I want to see a city that grew organically. I know St. Petersburg was built in a swamp, but the fact is that it then turned into a classic kind of old world city. Who wants to go and see a suburb created through abstract zoning laws? And yet they're the height of rationality. And now we've got all this urban infill because we have a bunch of professors who tell us how people ought to want to live. But it has nothing to do with how they actually want to live, which was, with a yard and a fence and some country around them. Oh, no, we've got to have high density infill because that's what computer program and a bunch of people whose brains function far too much like computers say ought to be what people want. Same thing with the metric system. You ought to want it. And, I'm worried about the United States today, but I will say somebody had said the difference between Canada and the United States is that when Pierre Trudeau told us to go metric, we did. And when Jimmy Carter told the Americans to go metric, they voted him out of office.
And they voted for
were right
Ronald
on
Reagan.
that one. There were other reasons for voting Pierre Trudeau out of office. But this one would have done, because it really is just the triumph of theory over practical wisdom. Oh, and I want to bring up, this is the modern mindset, so I'm going to use a Star Trek analogy, not from the original Star Trek series, but from Star Trek The Lost Generation. So remember the android, Data, who was everybody's favorite and was a good guy, and he had an evil twin brother called Lore. That is to say, scientific, mathematically manipulable information is good, traditional wisdom is bad. It was a classic cultural reference to this phenomenon that if it evolved because people found it useful, we got to get rid of it. If it comes from the projectors in academia, it must be good. So you shall now all measure everything differently than you did because a bunch of people you never met and who never met you are determined that your lives are just not being lived the way a human life ought to be lived, and you've got to get rid of everything you're used to, everything that makes sense to you, everything that was handed down from your ancestors, and at last we can begin to live as provided we are properly sanitized and incubated.
Right. I'll put you down as not really entirely a fan of the metric system. All right.
Just watching Logan's Run, Logan's Run, that world would be metric too. And the outside would be imperial.
See, people, what I live with. Oh, please send me some
culture.
sympathy. No, you, I mean.
Okay.
I get this all the time, okay? Do I get sympathy? Please send me some sympathy. All right. Also, send me some questions to ask John. If you want to play along, the URL on your screen will take you to a page where everything is explained. Come and help me, people. Thanks. See you next time.